Recording. All right. So welcome back. Today I have a guest with me, Dr. Dustin Atlas, who's the director of Jewish Studies and an assistant professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University. He specializes in contemporary Jewish thought, identity, and aesthetics,
Oh,
especially.
don't worry. Don't read the website. I don't even know what I specialize in anymore.
All right then. But I have Dr. Atlas here today because I wanted to focus on some Jewish thinkers and Jewish thought throughout classical German philosophy and German idealism, especially the people like Maimon, Mendelssohn, maybe later with Gassier. But yeah, so I have Dustin here today to speak about who Moses Mendelssohn was and what his philosophy is all about. So thank you for joining us.
Of course, I always like to promote Mendelssohn. He's like my grandfather.
So how did you, maybe we can just start off with, how did you get interested in Moses Mendelssohn's philosophy?
Oh, I got yelled at. I was in a Kant seminar and I said I didn't know Mendelssohn, and the teacher got mad at me and said that there's no excuse for me not knowing Mendelssohn. So I just started reading him. So it's not a very good story, but yeah, basically, Tristram Engelhardt, who passed away a few years ago at Rice, he's a Hegel and Kant scholar, genuine old school weirdo. Insisted I learn him, and once I started, it was just sort of continuous. He's sort of like he's a canonical figure in modern Jewish thought, but is in some respects not given the respect he deserves for a few reasons, partially because most of the debates that circle around him concern like Judaism and identity, and I think that those are boring and don't also really get at what he actually did, which was interesting. So it's more useful, I think, to view him. I don't want to say that, that's not fair. I find it more useful to view him like through a philosophical lens and see what his actual arguments and writing does than as a sort of Jewish political figure. I mean, he's important because he becomes sort of the figurehead for the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say he necessarily belongs to the Jewish Enlightenment as much as he was sort of their symbol of like the ideal educated philosopher Jew. But that's history, and I don't know anything about reality, so I could be totally wrong.
Um, yeah, no, I had been posting about Mendelssohn and about his importance for the Haskalah, for the Jewish Enlightenment. Um, but when I was looking at his writings, the writings that were published, the work on, well, his defense from Lessing on God's existence,
Mhm.
and some of his early writings on Leibniz and the Odyssey. Who would you say that maybe his earlier or maybe middle work were more focused on? What were the main concepts and ideas that he was really thinking through?
Okay, so Mendelssohn, the friendship with Lessing is sort of essential throughout. And Lessing is a weird, almost like philosopher clown, so it's very hard to know what Lessing thinks. Lessing, in some respects, though, Lessing and Goethe become the sort of like figureheads, as you know, of German idealism, these sorts of like ideal types. Um, Lessing, okay, so the early stuff is aesthetic, right? The early stuff is about aesthetics. That's its primary interest and primary function, with the exception of his book on the immortality of the soul, which I think is the one that sort of gets him famous. But his early philosophical writings, um, his concern is this new field called aesthetics, inaugurated by Baumgarten. Um, but what he does is Mendelssohn is very easy to misread because he's very generous and he's a very good writer. And so a lot of the time he downplay, whereas now we're supposed to up like whatever you do is revolutionary and going to transform the whole field, and you're supposed to put that at the center of everything.
Yeah.
He did very much the opposite. He acted a lot of the time like he was talking about other people while he was doing his own work, sort of standard in the commentary tradition. So, for instance, you find a footnote in his book and he says, oh, look, it looks here like Wolff and Leibniz disagree, but actually they agree. They're both saying the same thing. But the thing he says, they're not saying, he's saying that. So he does a lot of what I would call false conciliation, where he finds areas where people seem to disagree and creates a form of agreement, which actually is something that neither of the two original parties thought of themselves. He has an almost Wittgenstein, proto-Derridian sort of view of language, in that he does think most philosophical disputes are linguistic confusions. But unlike Wittgenstein, it's mostly like conversational confusions. So a lot of the time he says, look, you have this problem. The best way to do it is to get together and talk it out, and your words will grade against each other at first, but eventually you'll figure out that you're saying sort of the same thing. I don't know if that's true. But yeah, so he's very easy to misread because he's very gentle and generous with the reader. And so it's very easy to miss what he's doing. But the early stuff is about aesthetics. And if there's one thing which annoys me, it's that everyone acts like aesthetics started with Kant, which is absolutely false. Not only does he repeat a lot of the things found in Baumgarten and Mendelssohn, in some respects, he is a backward step, because Mendelssohn really brings the body into play. As so for I'm talking too much. Do you want to?
No. This is great.
Okay,
Please.
so like pre the so-called Kantian revolution, and again, I love Kant, but he tells this nice story of philosophy, and philosophers who are some of the most credulous readers in the universe just believe him, and that's obviously bonkers. Uh, so Leibniz, who is a much more sophisticated aesthetic thinker than people seem to think, um, inherits nonetheless this kind of notion of like the higher and the lower faculties. So the higher faculties are your brain and the lower ones are your body. And Mendelssohn is very intent on proving that all of these faculties have their own form of perfection. We can get to perfection in a moment because that's very important for him. Or imperfection, I think, is very important for him. And so he wants to give the lower faculties their due, their own type of thinking and their own kind of truth. And he finds this, unsurprisingly, in aesthetics at the time, meaning not so much the philosophy of art, but the philosophy of sensation and sensuality. You want to be careful here because there is a weird attempt. So most people, when they hear aesthetics, they think art. And then
Yeah.
there's this kind of reactionary, no, it's not about art. It's actually about the body. Look at Baumgarten and Meyer, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not so clear that you can actually distinguish the two, because Baumgarten's model for aesthetics is poetry, and Mendelssohn's actually much less interested in art. But nonetheless, art for them, I think, is art for them is the most important test case, because art is something designed just for sensuality. I mean, this is pre-conceptual art. So the whole point of making art for them is sensual. And so art is when humans design something for their own sensorium. So you can't really separate aesthetics into either sensation or just art. I think you have to move back and forth between the two. Where things get interesting, in addition to Mendelssohn sort of playing with empirical psychology, is that Mendelssohn, he's Jewish, so he's not as interested in the function of art for Baumgarten, which is a kind of religious edification, or Leibniz, where you see the whole in a work of art, which you see in Heidegger, whatever, the sort of, or Schelling, the sort of the specialness of art. Art has its own special revelation that you can't find in philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. He's not as interested in that. He's more interested in sort of classic aesthetic questions, which the most important for him is why do we like looking at ugly things? And I don't want to say this is totally new, because you see it in Aristotle, obviously, with his why do we like tragedy? It's a sort of version of the same question, but the Lisbon earthquake in particular throws Mendelssohn off, because he wants to know why everyone is so hungry to hear about it, see it, do disaster tours, and immediately afterwards see paintings of it, and so on and so forth, because his model, following Leibniz and Spinoza, because he's basically a Leibniz Spinozist by training, like in terms of modern philosophy, obviously.
Right.
Moses Maimonides is his first major philosophical figure, which also matters. So he has to sort this out, because for them, it's hard to explain why looking at ugly things would increase your pleasure or power or sense of vitality. And to answer this question, so if anyone's going to read any one thing from early Mendelssohn, he writes this little book called Philosophical Writings, or I forget what it was called. He gives it to Lessing to look at, asks if he thinks it's the sort of thing that be published. Lessing, as a gift, goes and publishes it and hands him the published copy of the book. Would that could happen now? And it's great, but the ugliness question is not really answered satisfactorily in it. So he writes two versions. We want the second version of a thing called Rhapsody, or Addition to the Letters on Sentiment. It's not a great title. And it's basically where he just goes hammer and tongs at this question. Why do we like looking at ugly things? And he comes up with a number of answers, and this is where his philosophy really starts to get interesting.
Wow.
Because, I mean, after Kant, we're all philosophers of finitude and limitation.
Yeah.
Everyone's interested in a limitation as a sort of function of thought. But the question is what type of limitation are you dealing with? And Mendelssohn and most of the Jewish tradition, including Maimonides, et cetera, I would suggest that the form of limitation they're interested in is not finitude as much as imperfection. Imperfection. So like dealing with imperfection, meaning like in a sort of grammatical sense, like incompleteness. And Mendelssohn really starts tackling the value of imperfection when he starts tackling the value of ugly works.
That's great. Thank you so much for
That's
that.
early Mendelssohn.
No, that's awesome. Actually, you brought up Maimonides, and now I'm intrigued. How much of would you say how much of Jewish thought is in his work? So people like Philo of Alexandria, or maybe Maimonides, or
So Philo isn't taken seriously by Jewish thinkers until about 5 minutes ago. So not really. Maybe he knew Philo, maybe not, but the whole form of interpretation used there. I'm simplifying everything I'm saying today. I'm going to say that once and just assume everything I'm saying is oversimplified. But Philo uses too much allegory to be of use to the tradition. So Christian thinkers are largely the ones who keep Philo going. Maimonides, in addition to his sort of apophatic thought, and I'm not going to address all the fights about that.
it's fine. It's fine.
Where he's of real value, partially is he's a gateway drug, right? So a lot of thinkers, they're just allowed to study him, and that becomes, and Maimonides wants to give reasons for things like the commandments, and this is obviously not approved of by any sort of standard rabbinic authority. So he's valuable as a gateway drug, but he's also valuable in that like the Arabic philosophical tradition comes into play. So Spinoza, who considers himself the great anti-Maimonidean, still carries forward elements of this tradition. The primary one being that the primary thing of value here, I think, for Mendelssohn and Spinoza is that there's no natural right tradition, really. Like there's traces of that in Mendelssohn. Again, it's an argument, but I'd say like the main thing that's brought forward is the idea that good politics is a matter of social convention and productive social conventions, not answering like a checklist or doing God's will. So that's why Spinoza goes off like a bomb to a certain extent. It's because he says, look, a lot of this shit is just convention, and it's a question of creating conventions that are the most powerful. And there's a lot more of that in Mendelssohn, but Mendelssohn is more generous than Spinoza and also believes in the existence of individuals. And so for him, you find rights and things like that nascent in nature, and then you have to perfect them. They're in imperfect form. So you have a kind of general biological desire to not punch babies in the face, right? Maybe. I mean, I'm hoping. And so Mendelssohn would say that's an imperfect right. Babies have an imperfect right to not be punched in the face. And then we as a society perfect that or complete it by, stipulating it, writing it down, making it a rule. And so so Mendelssohn, have you done the pantheism controversy?
So we can discuss it for sure. I would love to discuss it. I've read portions of it by Frederick Beiser and Oh my God, who else am I thinking? I'm blanking right now. This is only my first copy. I need two copies in before, the whole mind starts working.
You're an amateur. I'm on my third. So
I'm definitely an amateur.
okay, so I don't want to do the whole pantheism controversy then, but basically, like Jacobi writes a thing saying Lessing is a pantheist. Lessing is supposedly a good Christian, liberal Christian, so this is a problem, but it's a real problem because Lessing and Mendelssohn's friendship is famous, right?
Right.
It's famous because it's like this ideal friendship type between Christian and Jew. But if Lessing's not really Christian, then this is all going in the garbage. Now, I don't want to debate what pantheism means, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, this controversy is part of why Kant ends up so famous because he sort of provides a solution to it. But Jacobi is, in some respects, the great father of like kind of decisionist theology and decisionist political theology, like the idea that God makes a decision, then you have a world, and the sovereign makes a decision and like creates the state, and this and like so laws, the boundaries of the state, etc., are made out of nothing by human decisions or godly decisions. And then you have to protect those boundaries because inside of those boundaries, that's where you have like grandma sips tea at home. She have this nice, normal, ethical, blah, blah, blah. But how do you have this nice, normal, ethical world where you're sipping tea? Well, you demark it and you say, in this world, this is how you should behave. But that means it's got a border and you have to defend that border. And how do you defend that border? Well, we know how you do that. So decisionism like takes all the violence and puts it at the border, right? Because there's no real reason to have like that, like because it's a decision. And so it's sort of on or off again. Mendelssohn Will fighting Jacobi, and he does that again by redefining words. He's like, yeah, Lessing's a pantheist, but he's a refined pantheist, and I can explain to you what that means. And it's really not so terrible. He also is at war with this idea of deciding things by fiat, this sort of enthusiastic, and you see it again in Kierkegaard, although with much greater sophistication, and like in Carl Schmitt with much less sophistication. And even people like Zizek, but you see it again and again and again. And for Mendelssohn, this is poison, because if again for him, it's about growing things. It's like gardening. There's this nascent desire already in nature to let grandma sip tea, to treat each other nicely, and so you try to construct a system where the most people possible can like live like this, right? It's not your decision to just like impose a state or ethics. It's not your decision to sort of protect yourself. These are natural things and should be developed. In this respect,
So he's definitely a philosopher of the Enlightenment, of tolerance, of using practical reason, et cetera, et cetera. I'm
yeah,
sorry,
he's a liberal.
Kantian language. He's a liberal.
He's a liberal, like for better or for worse. And sometimes that can be really annoying, and sometimes it's good. But yeah, he's a liberal. With some complications, like he's sort of a universal liberal. He doesn't believe in, well, whatever. We can get into it later. But yeah, he has this general sense of tolerance, a general sense that you shouldn't accuse people of idolatry, unless because you don't know if it's idolatry unless you're seeing it from their position. Um, and yeah, generally a kind of religious tolerance, but his religious tolerance is weird because he thinks not only should you tolerate religions, but religions should also be forced to be somewhat tolerant of their own members, which is why he doesn't earn many friends. And so he just bites that bullet. He's just like, yeah, you shouldn't be allowed to excommunicate people if you run a religion, which is contested, especially by religious authorities. I mean, Mendelssohn is dangerous for reactionaries and absolutists of all stripes, which is why everyone tries to discount him as either a Protestant or wishy-washy or whatnot, because look, Spinoza's safe, right? Theocrats can be fine with Spinoza. Why? Because he's in or he's out, and he's out, right? He's just like, no, this is stupid. Religion is for the stupid kids in class. I'm not doing this. You shouldn't do this. Like, you should have a religion, of course, but it should be controlled by the state, and the function is to like provide a basic moral education to the morons. So it's easy. You just say he's out. You can claim him. He's like a Jewish intellectual, but he's a bad Jew. Fine. Mendelssohn sort of walks the line in that he is very religiously educated. He remains religiously practicing, but also refuses like to give up any of his sort of liberal commitments. So he's more dangerous because he's neither in nor out.
He was given I think honorary status, right? Honorary Jewish status in Berlin by the king, I believe. I think in like
Yeah. I mean, you had to be, I mean, basically owned or given permission to live there, and he was one of the few who was given permission. Again, that's history. I don't really understand how it worked, but I mean, you know,
but I'm interested. Maybe we can. So he was going to be like he was studying like the rabbinical works. He was going to be a rabbi, and then I don't think he actually continued. He became an academic, I guess, in his writings and stuff. So how much of
he's a businessman too, right? I mean, like a lot of these sort of enlightened thinkers, he's a gentleman of leisure, although he worked his ass off. And but yeah, I mean, um,
I was just
yes,
going to ask how I know from his early works he did study the Torah. He did study,
oh, his Talmud learning is so like my mom when he comes to town makes fun of all these German Jews because they don't know Talmud except for Mendelssohn, who he says knows his shit. He
yeah.
also translated the Torah into I guess you could call it Judeo-German. So it's German, but it's written in Hebrew characters.
Oh, cool. All right,
Again, a kind of gateway drug for people to learn German,
right.
which is why a lot of people didn't like it. In addition to certain word choices like translating God as eternal. Um, but I unfortunately, again, I'm not a historian, so I can't really help you with
Oh
most of
no,
this stuff.
that's
But
that's
yeah,
okay.
it's so it's important. I mean, so in terms of his, if anyone is interested in his, so all of his writings are religious and not religious at the same time, including his
Okay,
aesthetic ones. Jerusalem is the German language book most obviously about theopolitics. It's about religion and power. It's a piece of genius, but it's very easy to miss what makes it good. And then I think Yale has a bunch of clips from his Hebrew writings, including his commentary on the Bible, and certain commentaries on, I think, Maimonides' logic. That is the, sort of the best way of getting access to those if you're not reading Hebrew. But yeah, I think he wrote a Hebrew grammar too, but I don't remember. I know Spinoza did, but I'm not sure if he did one too.
all right. Well, we seem to have covered the early Mendelssohn's writings. What about his middle? Does he change from these kind of aesthetic writings, or does he merge into
Yeah, so his early stuff is aesthetic and metaphysical, right?
right?
Um, I think this grounds everything from that point on, but that might be special pleading because I like aesthetics. But no, I think you can make a case. Certainly, I think you can make a very strong case that his interest in like ugliness and the imperfect, and finding a kind of perfect, everything has and doesn't have a kind of perfection. Um, it's important that it's not totally perfect because otherwise it becomes absorbed into God. That's late. We can do that later. So the standard story is he starts like this, and then basically he gets dragged into religious controversy after religious controversy because basically various German liberal Christians come up with something along the following lines. Look, you say you're enlightened, you say you're very smart, but if you're so enlightened, how come you're still Jewish? And we all know that Judaism is this backwards ass, like, like whatever religion. To complicate things, I want you to defend your religion, but you are under a protected status. And if you get in trouble, all the Jews behind you get in trouble, and everyone in the room judging you is Christian. Go. So he has to very, very gently defend his religion without offending Christians.
Right.
And so that's why a lot of his so-called middle writings are going to be more about religion and tolerance and politics, because he just keeps getting dragged into these one after another conflicts. And some of them are pretty juicy. And to make a long story short, he says basically there's two sort of innovations. One is he takes from Spinoza, where he said, but warps it a bit, where he says Christianity is a religion of belief. You guys have to believe all this weird stuff. Judaism is a religion of acts. All we have to do is do weird stuff. So it's actually no conflict with enlightenment. Leave me alone. This is part of his much more profound theory of ritual and repetition. In that for Mendelssohn, tradition is a form of repetition. It's not like a steady hum. It's continuously repeated. So in a sense, tradition is continuously new and continuously, it's new because it's old and it's old because it's new, right? It's like a script, right? So for him, most religion should be read like almost like a musical script, and you perform it. But every performance is a new performance, but it's also an old performance, and all old performances are old because it's continuously new, and it's all new, kind of blah, 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 something like that.
Nice.
Interesting. Very important. Part of the reason he was so important for Hegel's development. The other thing so that's one. He says, look, we do practice, you do thought. Now, is this oversimplified? Of course. Is it a brilliant way of responding to these like calls for debate? Also, of course. And then the other thing he does is he just says, look, let's say Christianity is a house. You're in the upper floor, Jews are on the lower floor. You're saying to me the lower floor is unstable, so I should move to the upper floor. That doesn't make any sense. So basically, he says, if we go down, you go down too. Which is also, kind of theologically, it's an argument you can make.
That's a brilliant argument, actually.
Yeah, I mean, well, the way ultimately the German religious culture tries to get around it is by de-Judaizing Christianity and saying that Jesus is Aryan, and actually it's not built on a foundation. It's sort of a modern Marcionism, where the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God of the Old Testament, is a different God than the God of the New Testament. But yeah, they haven't done that work yet, so they're stuck with him. Yeah, so that's his middle period. I mean, the most famous work is Jerusalem, and it's not really middle, sort of nearing the end. And then at the end, you have the Pantheism controversy. So you have his sort of maybe a little bit boring, but smarter than people think, morning hours, and to the Friends of Lessing. But there, more than anything else, what's interesting is the project. And the project is to both defend Lessing against charges of pantheism, but also to sort of be like, yeah, I mean, here's the problem with pantheism. Here's why it's not gonna work. And his solution is very clever, I think. Basically, and him and Lessing present two kind of ways forward for thought, and Lessing very much is the idealist, and Mendelssohn is more of a historically minded thinker, which is why, again, Hegel needs him as well as Lessing. And Mendelssohn says basically to Lessing, look, if God has a perfect and total and complete idea of you, absolute knows everything about you, perfect, then what's the point of the real existing me? What is this even for, right? And Lessing goes, yeah, there's no need for that. That's bullshit. Everything's in God's head, right? Because God has this perfect idea, and so like, what is the idea? Just a copy of reality, or reality is a copy of the idea? You have two things doing exactly the same thing. There's no point in this, so let's get rid of the real, and we'll just play with God's mind, right? And Lessing, in this respect, is part of the German idealist tradition of sort of radicalizing Giacomo Fiore's like Johannine age, right? The age of pure logos, which you see throughout the idealist tradition. And it's also why the Jewish philosophy is both very entranced by idealism, but also like rejects it generally for this reason. Hermann Cohen is more complicated, and I don't understand him well enough to say how he deals with this. But yeah, he's just like, that's all God's head. And Mendelssohn says, no, there has to be real existing individuals with material bodies. And yeah, God has a perfect idea of you, but you're imperfect, right? And so God has a perfect idea of your imperfections, but he doesn't have your imperfections because God's perfect. So God operates in Mendelssohn's work as like the perfect, towards which the imperfect is always sort of striving. and sort of the completed concept of anything. But it's not real. It's a completed concept, and you still need the real to exist. You need the created world. You need creatures for Mendelssohn. Like you need the created world and all of the imperfect creatures in it, which are perfect in their imperfection, but they're not perfect in the sense of being complete. They're perfect, like seen as like they're perfectly themselves, right? But they're not. So Mendelssohn is both very modern, but also very old-fashioned. Like obviously, this idea of God having a perfect idea of everything is very hard to swallow now. But this idea of imperfection as a sort of driving force or a new way of or a way to think about finitude is not alien to us. So so yeah, it's complicated. But anyway, that's I mean, so that's sort of I think a general picture of his thought. Like Mendelssohn is always interested in imperfection, and he's always interested in how to make it perfect. And he's always interested in growth and materiality, and he kind of wants to have both. He wants concepts and he wants materiality, and he wants them to both exist at the same time, and he wants them to be related but not the same thing.
So not to not to compare or contrast here,
Why not?
but there's a text by Augustine called Against the Academics, where Augustine says truth is never incarnate, truth is the journey, truth is the search.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to ask, in a similar sense, is perfection the main concept of his work, where you're on the path or on the...
I think imperfection is the main concept, because the idea of perfecting things is standard, right?
Right.
Like it's standard practice throughout the Enlightenment that people think that the perfect is the good and the good is the perfect, and this is where you're heading.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Leibniz is completely saturated with it. I mean, the thing is with Leibniz, obviously, and Mendelssohn, the criterion for truth is not is harmoniousness, right? So it's and I don't know if that's easy or hard to swallow now. I vacillate. Sometimes I buy it and sometimes I don't. But yeah, for them, like it's dissonant voices, complex, oversaturated voices. Leibniz is famous. Like you're at the beach, you hear all the waves, but most of them are unconsciously distributed throughout you. Where I would say what Mendelssohn does is he says that a lot of things that were previously regarded as imperfect are perfect, and a lot of things that were previously regarded as perfect are imperfect. For him, a completely conceptual like existence is shallow and thin. And he's very clear. He thinks this is why modern philosophy, the one thing modern philosophy has over ancient philosophy is that now you have the tools to respect the created world or the bodies in a way that for Plato and whatnot, he thinks they didn't have the ability to appreciate material, what we'd call materiality now. Again, is he right or is he wrong? I don't know, but that was definitely what he valued about Spinoza and Leibniz and Locke. But yeah, I mean, for him, perfection is not will be a completed harmony, not like a completed like sort of solid state of things.
You know, that makes a lot of sense. So I had no idea who Mendelssohn was, unfortunately. My undergraduate was just filled with, of course, Kant and Hegel and, of course, some Fichte when I got to graduate school. But as I began reading, historical texts on the history of classical German philosophy and German idealism, I started coming across all these names I had no idea. And I was rethinking a lot of these ideas, and I'd heard of Maimon, back and through some of the works of like Paul Guyer and Wood, but I'd never heard of Mendelssohn. And then I came across some of his writings and I was really intrigued. That's why I kind of reached out to you. So
yeah, I mean, the thing is with Mendelssohn, if you go back to him, it's important to remember you're not going to get a lot of like standard philosophical arguments. It's more like you want to watch the process and you want to get involved in the ways he thinks about things are often more important. If you're looking for sort of philosophy bro debate club, like if you want to go, it's not going to work for you. And partially because he treated, so for him, standard philosophy bro debate club stuff, he's like, it's a fortress to defend things you're already committed to, but you don't want to live in a fortress for him,
Right.
right? It's sort of the last resort to defend um these commitments, which are often more like aesthetic and historical and communal. And so he does do that kind of stuff, but it is a last resort. He would rather show you different ways of thinking than argue with you head to head. And even when he does do his arguments, you got to watch him, because he's not usually he's still trying to get you into a different type of play than kind of standard giving reasons and fighting for them. Not that he's incapable of that; he's more than capable of it. It's just not really his goal. Um, and that again, that's why he's very important. So part of the problem, the reason you don't read him is because Kant, you need to know Kant more. Kant is just the most important figure, and if you're going to do any, if you're going to like lose your mind on anyone in German philosophy, it has to be Kant first, right? Um, but part of the problem is Kant. For
Right.
Kant, like Mendelssohn is the last great dogmatist, and then there's me, right? Like, so it's like that guy was great, but he's the last of the old guard. You don't really need him. You need me. I'm going to lift a bunch of his ideas and not like credit them, which is, I'm not a criticism. That's just how people did things. Footnoting was, more for a witticism than to credit anyone. You certainly didn't have to credit Jews. But it's why he's important for Kant. He's important for Hegel. It's why Carl Schmitt hates him.
Of
You know,
course. Yeah.
because there is a sort of, it is a more developed, because he's into development and repetition and growth. If you want like a kind of imperial, austere, if you want the Pauline kind of line, like then you're not going to get it there. He actually goes very hard. He actually takes Joachim Fiore on directly. Well, indirectly, I guess. He says, I don't know under whose crazy inspiration Lessing wrote this nonsense about humanity evolving, but it's absolutely, he knew full well, but basically he's like, there's no such thing as human progress. All progress is got to be done individual, or it happens a little bit and then you fall back. But for him, history is not a story of linear progression. It's a story of survival and growth and development, sure, but also regress, violence. um, he had a much more realistic view of history.
That's interesting because most of the Enlightenment thinkers are all about progress. We're progressing from the past, the movement away from natural right to human rights, tolerance, etc. So
Yeah, so he doesn't really buy any of that. Like, he's like, of course you should try to progress. You should do that. You should try to grow up, but you'll also grow up, you'll get old and you'll die. And that's got to be okay too, right? This eternal like teenager development thing was not for him. Um, to defend some of the enlighteners, I really buy Cassir's reading, which is that for some of them, progress is just like it's just, reason is developing and progress is just what they call that development. And it's not necessarily like better. But yeah, no, definitely Mendelssohn stands out as being a pretty defiant anti-progress guy who's not a cynic. Like, he's not saying, oh, humans suck and so we can't progress. He's just like, it's just not how history and materiality work for him. Um, it's not because we're garbage. It's just because that's how the world is constituted. In fact, would you and I mean, for him, it just would be undesirable to grow up in a kind of state of completion or perfection. But
does he in his metaphysics, does he have a, is God a kind of ground, or like can you maybe hash out some of his arguments
he's
for
tricky with God, and I'm not God's biggest fan, so I'm not always paying the most attention to those things. But no,
well, either am I,
yeah,
but I
for him,
wonder.
God is he's very clear. Like, if God didn't exist, he wouldn't do what he does. Like, so for Mendelssohn, God has to exist, and God has to sort of ideally care about you in some way. And for him, this is just the case. He's satisfied if you don't think that, as long as you think there's some kind of, he's fine with Spinoza's substance, as long as you're willing to always try to emulate and become better like this. Does Spinoza think this himself? I have no idea, probably not. You never know with Spinoza, though. There's this weird short circuit into substance, which happens, like he sort of cheats. I would say more God knows like the hidden. So if you see a rock, you see the front bit, and maybe no one ever sees the other bit, but God sees it and God knows and God has an idea. So God is this kind of completed idea of everything. If you flip the rock over, you now see the rock for the first time, but God has already seen it for Mendelssohn. That's the most important thing, other than caring about you. I tell my students that a lot of like in the Judeo-Arabic philosophical tradition, the question is not does God exist, but does God give a shit about you? And that's the more important question for people like Mendelssohn. It's obvious to him that God exists in some form. The question is God just like a knower, or does God actually like care? He thinks God cares.
Actually,
Hmm?
I said that helps a lot, actually.
But I mean, it's true for most of them. They're like, yeah, there is God, but the question is, what do you mean by God, right? And for most of them, God is just this Aristotelian style God who just knows everything and sort of impels things. And for Mendelssohn, that's good enough, right? But that's not what he believes, because he believes also in historical revelation, which is where things get sort of tricky, because he thinks that what's revealed historically can only be like practices or things to be repeated. So you get the score is historically revealed, not metaphysical truths. Metaphysical truths you can do whenever you want. You can do them 2,000 years ago, and you can do them 2,000 years from now if we're still around, God willing. But revealed truths are more about like truths of like behaviors, aesthetics, things you do. And for him, these are revealed, but they're revealed to a community.
Okay.
And that community has to remain consistent, because you can't like know history without some sort of kind of continual chain connecting you to it. But that chain has to be repetitive, right? It's not just something like an object you hold. It's like fire. It has to keep burning, and you have to keep adding stuff to it. So yeah, I think that's so God's sort of metaphysical function is perfection. God is perfect, and you're not. The whole world isn't. That's God's metaphysical function, but God also has historical and aesthetic functions.
Thank you for that.
Of course.
Why? Okay, so now transition is for a second. So why should we continue to read Mendelssohn, do you think? Why?
I mean, he's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, his thinking about aesthetics is actually just brilliant, and there's nothing else quite like it. Like I said, first off, I think his philosophy of imperfection is just really smart and really good. His aesthetic work is brilliant. His thinking about ugliness is actually very, very contemporary. And it is annoying to see people reinventing the wheel again and again and again and acting like he doesn't exist. So I think you should read all of the early thinkers of aesthetics. But I think in a way he's even more important than Baumgarten. Well, I don't want to say that. You should read Baumgarten too. But the thing is Mendelssohn embodies it, brings it into the world, but also it's just less edifying. And part of the problem with philosophical aesthetics is it's always so bloody edifying, right? It's like you see a fraction of God or the absolute or whatnot in art, but that's actually not what art is doing most of the time, and that's okay. And so he is much better at figuring out why art and why aesthetics matters. He's a very humane thinker. He's one of the few liberals I think it's easy to stomach, because he's not actually looking to reintegrate a hierarchy via like capital and self-organizing machines. His thought about tolerance is far more impressive than Locke's sort of cruel and austere form of tolerance. But yeah, I mean, I would say the main thing you should read for is the aesthetics. The aesthetics are brilliant. And if only to get rid of the nonsense idea that Kant sort of begins aesthetic thinking in Germany, to see that it has a past, but also that the past is richer in ways that Kant is actually incapable of really addressing himself, because for Kant, aesthetics is always serving a function.
Right.
right? It's always there to explain, like in the first stuff, like how space and time function, et cetera, or in the last work to a certain extent to like as a basis for a kind of naturalized teleology, which, I think it's a great project, but there's very little attention paid to actual sensuality, actual sensation, and actual art. And if you want an aesthetic, if you want to think about aesthetics in a way that does do more than take account of like how Kant thinks a person functions, Mendelssohn's good. But I don't want to say you should read Mendelssohn just to flesh out Kant. I think you should read him for himself. Again, he's a very, it's hard to find any defenders of sort of any kind of humane liberalism right now.
True. Yeah.
I'm not even sure if I am a humane liberal, but I do know that it's like a tradition that's at least worth thinking about and defending. I guess in this regard, I'm like sort of on the Frankfurt School. I like at this point we need something like we need socialism to defend liberalism, like the gains of liberalism. But
I tend to side with Ernst Bloch's Spirit of Utopia, kind of like Schillingian Novalisian Marxian romanticism.
yeah, not me. I'm more like you live in like a broken sort of messed up world, and you have to like kind of help things along and help
That's
them
actually
repair them and complete them, and they have to help you, and ideally you help each other as much as possible and sort of develop something that doesn't totally suck. And yeah, Mendelssohn, and also Mendelssohn is just in the world in a way that a lot of these other Germanic thinkers aren't, if only just because he's Jewish and he's forced to be. But
so.
yeah, I think everyone should read his aesthetics because they're a delight. That they will actually help you think about certain aesthetic, and it'll also just stop philosophers in general from being all myopic Kantians at heart, because not because they have any sort of principled agreement with Kant on this, but just because that's all they've read. And I mean, I think the same thing with Leibniz. You should read Leibniz too for the same reason. I mean, half of Kant is just Leibniz, and it seems bizarre to me that people don't see this. But
That's a good point. Um, part of the next part of the next series of videos I'm going to be doing are focusing on Jewish thinkers, because I think there's a lot lacking for information for people to have introductory works to them. So I'm going to have Paul Franks on after I put out this video. So discuss Maimon and some of the
well,
work.
he knows a lot more about like history than I do, so you should just ask him the same things you asked me, and he'll do it
No, no,
better.
no,
But
no, 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 no.
but
No,
no, I mean the Jewish element to German thought is under and overplayed at the same time in a way that I don't really understand why it happens that way. And the problem with a lot of thinking about German Jewish thought is it becomes just a supplement to idealism or a thing you read because some of the idealists read it too. And I think there's a way in which Mendelssohn actually represents an entire philosophical trajectory that Kant ended, but didn't. But and then it had to sort of continue in a sort of subterranean fashion or secretly. But actually, in some respects, I think is preferable. I think in some respects, Kant is an absolute disaster, and that Mendelssohn. I mean, I love Kant too, but like I think in terms of just dominating the tradition so absolutely and thoroughly afterwards is a bad thing, and that there is a gentler, more, I don't know. I keep repeating myself. I think there's another tradition, and in some respects, a better tradition that Mendelssohn offers sort of a glimpse at, and so does Maimon, in his own way too. So yeah, I think you should read them for their own sake and not just to flesh out your
For
knowledge.
for those that want to pick up something by Maimon, there's a Cambridge selection of philosophical writings with a majority of some of the things that we talked about. Do you think that's a good way to start? Or just
Mendelssohn or Maimon?
Mendelssohn, sorry.
I mean, I think you should get the Green Cambridge, like the early philosophical writings, and read those first, and then
Yeah.
read Jerusalem second. Um, the early philosophy, that's a whole text. It's not snippets. It's just that they're small because it's composed of like 6 smaller pieces or something like that. But yeah, the problem is that book is usually about $1 zillion for no reason that I can understand. But or maybe it's cheaper again. But yeah, the Moses Mendelssohn, that green volume, early philosophical writings, I think it's called, is gold. I mean, I've read mine like 100 times. And then Jerusalem is there's an edition of that, which is probably your second thing. And then the late Bruce Rosenstock has a thing called Last Works, and I'd read that last.
I wanted to jump into the morning hours, but it's a Springer text. It's like $300, and that's just not.
No, there's 2 editions, and one of the editions is in Bruce Rosenstock's Last Works, and it
Oh,
is
okay.
not expensive. And in fact, he did a God on Rosenstock also translated Mendelssohn's little piece God on Trial, which is great. It's a sort of rewriting of one of Leibniz's pieces, but without the Christianity. And it's interesting also just to read them side by side. But yeah, if you want to read that, get the Last Works. Don't buy the Springer edition. Not because it isn't a great translation, but just because it's $1 zillion and you probably don't have that kind of money.
No,
You can always pirate the ebook though. Not
true.
that I would promote that because that would be wrong. But yeah, no, the morning hours is very good. But for me is best read because it's a metaphysical fortress as something defending things that he's already developed elsewhere with more flesh and blood on them.
All right.
I don't know.
Well, thank you so much for coming here and introducing Mendelssohn and taking us through from the early, the middle, and finally the late. And I want to thank you for your time. This was really great, actually. And you were really funny too, so that was wonderful.
No need to end with a lie. All right, thank you very much for having me and
All right.
putting up with my blah blah blah. All right,
No,
see you.
no, you're it was just great. You're no one wants to hear me. That's why I bring professionals on here to speak about these.
Yeah, I wouldn't call me a professional. You don't know me very well. All right, talk to you later.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.